this afternoon. Who should we start with? Douglas, why don't we start with you? Impact on migration if we left the EU?
Well, if we left the EU, all of the problems of the migration crisis that are going on in Europe and the mass movement of peoples from around the world trying to break into Europe, all of that would still be going on. The world wouldn't change, the Middle East wouldn't change, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa wouldn't change. The one thing that would change is that this country would have the option of keeping our own borders, running our own borders, the government of Britain being the ones who had a say on who we brought in and how our borders were kept. And that isn't the case at the moment. And as I think I pointed out on your programme recently, it can't be said often enough. The oddity of our current situation is that, for instance, David Cameron and Theresa May have repeatedly said in recent years that the reason why their migration figures have not been able to be met is because of the EU. And now David Cameron and Theresa May are trying to persuade the British public that therefore, nevertheless, we should be trying to stay in the thing that has stopped them being able to do what they promised the public they would do. So it's a very significant circle for them to square, and we'll see if they can.
Diego, when it comes to the fact that the government has promised, as we've been hearing there from Douglas, to keep a cap on immigration, and that doesn't happen, 300,000 plus net coming into the United Kingdom last year alone. Does that not then open the doors for xenophobes to say, see, ha, told you so?
Well, I think in a way it does, but if you look at the economic impact that the migrants coming in are having, it's hugely positive. They're filling positions for which there are no native workers. They are net contributors to the exchequer. So a study found that they contribute about £20 billion a year to the exchequer. The Bank of England has shown that they're more likely to be self-employed, more entrepreneurial. So the vast majority of the migrants coming into this country, whether from the EU or outside the EU, tend to be highly productive and highly contributing members of society. I think it is important, though, to distinguish between the refugee crisis that is going on in the Middle East and that is spilling over into Europe, and the issue of intra-European migration as a result of the European Union. And those are highly different. As Douglas said, the refugee crisis will continue after the Brexit referendum, whichever way the vote goes. And it is important to recognize that this is a humanitarian issue. This is an issue of what we do with people who are trying to flee areas of conflict and whose lives are in danger. And that's a different story from the economic judgment that we make about how immigration to the UK should take place. But immigration is highly beneficial to the UK economy. If we have a lot of immigration, it's because the UK economy is doing relatively well and unemployment is down and demand for workers is up.
Okay.
And so,
overall, it's beneficial. First of all, almost everything you said there is highly contestable. Let me just throw one thing in. Actually, a study from University College London a couple of years ago showed that over a 15-year period, migrants to the UK took out 95 billion more in services than they put in back in taxation. So the idea that, as it were, we only get financial benefits from migration is at the very least highly disputed. As for my fellow guest mentioned about the wider migration crisis, he then, if I can say so, made a very important mistake. He talked about this as if it was solely a humanitarian crisis caused by refugees coming and trying to gain entry into Europe, and that isn't the case. You see, the European Commission's own Vice President, Frans Timmermans, said only a couple of weeks ago, admitted himself only a couple of weeks ago, that at least 60% of the people who came into the EU last year should not be there. They should not be in the EU because they are not asylum seekers. They are at best economic migrants. Now, the great question for us in Britain is it indeed the case that we can run our own borders, we can keep our own border system and know what's best for our country? Or is it the case that we should put these decisions and keep these decisions and indeed increase the power of the decision-making to those people like Frans Timmermans and others when they have just made this mistake? Because let's remember, if he is correct, and I think he's significantly underestimated the number of people who've come in who are actually economic migrants rather than asylum seekers, that means that the EU now has to deport around 750,000 people from Germany. Is it going to do that? Of course not. What it's going to do, what it has been trying to do, has been to try to force quotas on countries. Now, if this country votes to remain in, and has in our first vote for 40 years on this matter, it's a very important moment because, among other things, it will mean that the European Commission and others will get the green light that in future Britain will be one of the countries they will be able to try to force such quotas on. And as I say, the Commission doesn't know who it's letting in. It doesn't know these things.
Diego?
The UK already has control over its borders in the sense that Douglas is suggesting here. The UK has border controls, and it can determine who comes in and who leaves. Where the UK doesn't currently have policy power is in terms of internal EU migrants, which is why it's so important to keep the distinction right. But we shouldn't, because we shouldn't conflate the refugee crisis with the issue of intra-EU migration, because Douglas, if I may say so, you are making it seem like the question of refugees is something that's out of the control of the UK, which it isn't, and you're mixing that together with economic migration. All the studies that I've seen, you mentioned one study, all the studies that I have seen, and the one I've seen about 20 billion is also from UCL, but all of the studies worldwide done on migration show beneficial effects, both on the private level and also on the public level. I'm sorry, that's just what the economic consensus is.
First of all, it's not by any means a consensus. These studies on this pretty much, as I said before, cancel each other out. The interesting thing is, though, is that this is a typical economic argument, a typical argument by economics, which is to talk about our countries as if they are businesses, effectively. How much money can we get out of migrants? How much money do they bring in? How much services can they provide? And, of course, most people in Britain, survey after survey shows, do not regard the primary thing of migration, the primary interest of migration, as to whether or not we can squeeze work out of migrants and how much work we can squeeze out of them and so on. The UK isn't UK PLC. We're not a bank. We're not some hedge fund. We're not some business or anything else. We are, among other things, also a culture and a society. And so all of these questions have things far more than economics at their heart.
Of course.
As for that point about the EU, well, the problem is this, isn't it? Chancellor Merkel, the German Chancellor and the most important figure in Europe, has done something that I think most people, right and left, are starting to realise was an absolutely crazy thing last year, bringing in more than 1 million migrants to Germany, not knowing who they were, asking them to come in, and thus encouraging millions more to come in the years ahead. Now, the question for us, again, in the referendum is whether or not we want to tie our futures to a community that is able to make such spasmic movements, and whether we want to be paying the price for that, because we will have to. If we remain part of the EU, we will have to take our quotas, we will have to do what we're told.
Okay, we are almost out of time, but final thought from you, Diego. Make it a good one.
The UK has a history as an open society and an open economy, and it has benefited enormously from migration since it joined the European Union. And it's precisely because it's such a global power that it attracts so many migrants from within the EU. Now, regardless of the refugee question, which will continue, I say, even after Brexit, it is important to keep in mind that a liberal migration policy for the UK is beneficial for both the public accounts and also for private individuals and for our society.
And not necessarily for the country as a whole.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we are out of time, so we will have to leave it there. But you'll be pleased to know that we're going to have a regular clinic here on Sky News on a Tuesday afternoon between now and the end of June, and to answer quite a lot of the questions that people will have about staying in or leaving the EU. So perhaps you'll both come back and talk to us then, will you?
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.